So now that we've got a basic understanding of chemistry, we're going to focus on organic chemistry. And organic chemistry is the study of molecules based on carbon. The reason why this really gets its own field is that all living things are made of the element carbon, or fundamentally built out of carbon. And so organic chemistry is about organic beings or living things. In particular, we're going to focus in this chapter on macromolecules, which are very large molecules. And some of these you're familiar with already, like proteins or fats that you know from what you know about nutrition. And these molecules are all built out of carbon. So why is carbon so special, and why is it the foundation of living molecules? Well, if you remember back to valence electrons, carbon has 4 valence electrons. And because it has 4 valence electrons, it can make up to 4 bonds. If we look at some of the other elements that are important in life, nitrogen can only make 3 bonds, oxygen can only make 2, hydrogen can only make 1. So carbon can basically be bonded to 4 different things. So here's this example. Here's a carbon with 4 different bonds. Because it can be bonded like that, it can arrange itself in long chains, sometimes hundreds of carbons long. So this one is only 3 carbons long, but you could have carbon chains, and this could go out for thousands and thousands of carbons. That's how our DNA is. That's how proteins are, hundreds and thousands of carbons long. Carbon is also important because you may remember that it's relatively weak. So when it is interacting with oxygen, it forms polar covalent bonds. If it interacts with hydrogen, it's a polar covalent bond. But if it's with hydrogen, it's a nonpolar bond. And of course, carbon to carbon is also nonpolar, because anytime you have 2 of the same, it's going to be nonpolar. So again, what's really significant about carbon is that it can bond up to 4 times, and so this allows it to form complex structures. In this example here, we have just straight chains that vary based on length. So this is a straight chain of 2 carbons. This is a straight chain of 3 carbons. You can have straight chains of 5, 6, 7, and so on, chains of carbon. Maybe you recognize this one, propane. This is, of course, the fuel that many of you probably use in your barbecues. Carbon chains can branch, and so this begins to build complex shape. Remember, we talked about shape when we were talking about bonds. So this molecule here on the left is just making a straight chain. While this one, if you imagine the shape of it, is shaped like a little hat. So if that was floating around, it would be shaped like a little hat. If you look closely and count carbons, you'd see that there's 4 carbons in both of these molecules and 10 hydrogens in both of these molecules. So I can take the same basic components, and by branching, I can create different shapes. Carbon can also double bond to itself. And so this is hard to see in this image, so let me redraw this for you a little bit. So this is this one, and this one, the one on the right, is this. So in other words, this is a double bond here, and this is a double bond here. And so if you notice, the double bond is in a different position. So this is a very different molecule called 1-butene. This is 2-butene. They're going to act differently just because that double bond is in a different position. Carbon can also fold and make rings. So this is cyclohexane. It's forming a 6-carbon ring. Benzene, maybe some of you have heard of, forms a ring with double bonds in it, which you can see here. And so carbon, just carbon and hydrogen, can create lots of different shapes, lots of different structures. So we're building complexity just with carbons and hydrogens. So when you just have carbons and hydrogens in a molecule, it's called a hydrocarbon. So pretty straightforward, carbons and hydrogens. Because it's carbon to hydrogen bonds, remember carbon to hydrogen bonds are nonpolar. So we're talking about this, and these are both nonpolar bonds. So this whole molecule is nonpolar, which makes it hydrophobic. This is what fat is, and which is why fat doesn't dissolve in water. This is showing fat that's been stained red, and so the fat droplets in tissue have to be kept separate from the water-based tissue where it's sitting in. And so that's what you see depicted here. This is the long chains of carbons and hydrogens. So this is usually 20 or 30 carbons long in fats, and making this molecule be hydrophobic. Molecules in living things are much more complex than hydrocarbons usually, because they will have the addition of groups of atoms called functional groups. So this name should clue you into the fact that functional groups provide a lot of the function to molecules. So this here, for example, is a functional group. This is a functional group. This is a functional group. This is a functional group. Here's a functional group, functional group, functional group. The part in yellow is a carbon-hydrogen base. So there's carbons and carbon to hydrogen in here. So the functional groups are kind of added on to that hydrocarbon base. But they're really what gives uniqueness to these molecules. These two molecules depicted here are estrogen, which you probably know is the female hormone, and this is testosterone, which is the male hormone. The base of both of these molecules is virtually identical. It's this hydrocarbon ring structure. So the difference between a man and a woman fundamentally comes down to this functional group and this functional group, because these two are the same between them. So the only difference between a man and a woman, right, so that's a pretty big biological difference, is the presence or absence of these functional groups. So again, you can't underemphasize the importance of function in that term, functional groups. So this is a list from your textbook of the functional groups, and I've got a sort of sub-list here of the ones that you need to be able to recognize on site and name for exams and for the rest of the semester, because we're going to see them multiple times. So an amino group, a carboxyl group, a phosphate group, hydroxyl group, and a sulfhydryl group. These are the ones that you need to be able to recognize and name. Notice that when I was drawing these, I always drew this bond here. So this is helping to remind us that functional groups are always attached to carbon. So if I go back to this previous slide, here's the functional group, the hydroxyl group. There's the bond attaching it to some other carbon molecule. So a functional group by definition is always attached to carbon.